Hey, it's Dan Kenner with another episode of The Casual Author. Today is Monday, October 9th, 2023, as I record this, and this is episode number 92 of the podcast. Today, we're talking to Mikel Melwasul about how he went about crafting and creating his epic fantasy world. We go over all the different steps he took to reach publication. We talk about his creative process, all the people that helped him dive into the world, and how he went about formulating that world in preparation to write it. So it's kind of a combination of plotting and discovery writing. It's an excellent conversation. If you are writing epic fantasy or high fantasy or you're considering it, definitely want to stick around for that part of the interview. So before we dive into all that fun stuff, updates on the Kenner homestead as well as in the author business. So on the homestead, a lot of things are kind of reaching an end. They're wrapping up. We are finishing up pulling out all of the plants from the garden. I've talked about this before. Today was potato harvesting day. So we went through and harvested all of our potatoes. The yield was much better than last year. I think we planted around, I want to say 30 pounds of seed potatoes, and we got 180 out of it. So pretty decent yield. I mean, I don't know what to expect necessarily because last year our yield was very small. We barely got double last year. They were all very teeny tiny potatoes. There's not much you can do with those. This year, we got some pretty big ones. We did plant russets, which we've never done before. Last year, we tried to plant some like fancy golden variety, and they didn't turn out great. They tasted great, the little ones. But yeah, this year we got about 180 pounds, which we're very thrilled about. Digging them up is very time consuming, but it was great. My wife and I just went out there and spent a few hours outside. The chicken run is getting very close to being completed. I put some more boards up, put some more chicken wire up, and I got one of the gates hung this time. So yeah, it's shaping up pretty well. Looking forward to being able to put the chickens in there and see how they behave. I think they were in a smaller space last year, so they fought a lot. There were some of our chickens that were a little bit naked because, through the pecking order, chickens are mean, first off. Chickens are about the meanest thing in the world. They're creepy for one because they eat everything, and two, they are mean. So no matter what we try to do to prevent the bullying, they just bullied a couple of the chickens, the ones that were at the bottom of the pecking order, and they were practically naked. I'm honestly surprised that they did okay during the winter. They did, the very bitter cold winter, but hoping to avoid that if there's more space for them. Not that they were cramped. I mean, they had plenty of space. I think they were just a little stir crazy because they couldn't see the sun very well. The way the coop has been set up, it was built by the previous owners, is the coop and run is facing north. And so the sun, particularly during the winter when they're in there, is a little bit more south. And so it never shines into the run. It's roofed and it's, fenced off. And so they don't really see the sun. Now, we've been wanting to build an outdoor run for some time now. We finally did. There's going to be no ceiling or roof on it. It's just going to connect to the already existing piece. So we're almost doubling, actually more than doubling the space now. But they can come outside now. They will be able to go outside and get some sun. So hopefully that'll make them a little less stir crazy and hopefully less mean. But, we'll find out. Who knows? Other than that, yeah, we are getting excited. My wife particularly is getting excited to dry the goats up. We're not that close yet. We're still a few weeks out, but their milk has started to decline. It always happens about October, end of October, middle of October. And so we'll drop the second milking, which means we will just milk in the morning. So advantages is you don't have to go out as often. So yay, that's good. Less time. But obviously we're getting less milk. So we aren't making as much cheese because there's not as much milk. This is an interesting fact about goats and goat milk. If you didn't know this, late term lactation and their lactation process tends to have higher cheese yields because of the actual, I don't even know what it is, milk fat content in there. And so the cheese is actually getting bulkier and bulkier as it goes on and as their milk declines. So even though we can't make as much cheese, like as many batches of cheese, because you go from the weight of the milk, the cheese blocks we are making are bigger and bulkier. So it's kind of funny how that happens. But yeah, we've started breaking out some of the cheeses and they are so good. They're fantastic. Definitely recommend goat cheese made a specific way because, you hear people say goat cheese, that's gross. And admittedly, the stuff you buy from the store tastes kind of like goat. Or if you're close in proximity to a buck, it kind of tastes like a buck. So nasty, gross. But my wife's homemade cheese tastes just like normal, cow milk cheese. It's fantastic. So enjoying that as we're breaking those open. This last weekend, we also had this is not homestead related, this is family related. We had a party. We tried to do a little movie party for our kids. We have 6 kids. We homeschool them. We have a blast with them. So we let them help make the food. This yesterday's theme was rainbows. So we created a bunch of rainbow food. We had some rainbow pasta that we cooked up, and vegetables and cheeses and everything that was the colors of the rainbow. And then, some fruit in the shape of a rainbow. It was just a lot of fun. But we're finding that those types of experiences, getting the kids in the kitchen, getting them out in the garden with us, getting them to help with the animals, is really enriching for them. They're learning a lot of great skills. They're getting stronger. So we have our sons carry buckets of water, and they're getting stronger. So learning all of those skills and just building up their practical muscles is really good for them. So they've been having a blast with that. They're getting more and more involved the older they get. So that is another advantage of homeschooling on a homestead. So in terms of author news, I did complete my last round of edits for the 3rd book of The Kids of Cyber City, celebrating massively. Like, I could jump up and cheer. I love being done editing because I don't like editing. I wish I could say that I was done editing forever. I'm not, clearly. Still have Dragon Blooded, but I need to take a break from editing now and get back into the writing. I've talked a little bit about this before, but I'm really looking forward to diving into Demon Blooded, which is the 2nd book of the Hidden Heritage series, is what I'm calling it. I've written the first 5, I think 6,000 words actually, and I'm looking forward to picking that up and keeping going. So really that's going to be my focus, is just getting into writing, not worrying too much about the editing, just taking a break. I'd like to try and get the 2nd book done, written, first draft, before I come back and edit Dragon Blooded. We'll see if that actually happens, because if I want to get it out at any given, any close time, then I'm going to have to edit Dragon Blooded. I have a different method that I'm going to try, so hopefully that makes it less painful, but alas, we'll see. So other than that, the author business is moving along. I have been making videos and preparing to do more with my YouTube channel. So as you're aware, if you're listening to this podcast, you may be watching it on YouTube, which thanks for being here. If not, if you're listening to this on Spotify or Google Podcasts, or it's all over the place. You can listen to pretty much anywhere in podcast form. I'm trying to think about how I can do more with YouTube. I'd like to take advantage of YouTube as a platform more. I haven't really loved TikTok. It hasn't served me well. There's been a lot of problems with it in terms of productivity, and algorithm is just not worth it for me, frankly. So I'm going to be trying YouTube. We'll see how that goes. Now, currently, I'm just kind of strategizing, putting together videos. I haven't posted a lot yet, but I'm going to kind of have a backlog prepared and then start posting them. So the one thing about me in my unpredictable life is I can't always plan on predictability, which clearly I just said that, but it makes it difficult to go full on invested in multiple platforms, because if I get behind, and then I stop posting. And that's what's happened with TikTok, frankly. Just haven't had a lot of time. I haven't even been on the application, and haven't posted anything, haven't interacted with anything. There's just been no time. And so with YouTube, I feel like I can get a little bit of a head backlog of videos and information about what's going on with me, book reveals, and whatnot. So there's going to be some fun things coming up for you. So if you really do want to talk to me, engage with me through the podcast comments, through my YouTube channel, through email, would love to interact with you. I love to chat with you, hear what you think about the podcast episodes, as well as just hear what you think about my books. So yeah, that's where we stand with the author business, just plugging along, having a good old time. But I believe that's all of the updates so far. So we can go ahead and shift over to the interview portion of the podcast. Hey, Mick, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Dan?
Doing very well. Excited to dive into your story, to learn more about your book, why you wrote it, where it came from. But before we get into all that, how long have you been writing and publishing?
How long have I been writing and publishing? I've been writing for, let's see, it was about 2017 is when I really started doing it. I wrote some short stories in like 8th grade back in like 2012. But 2017, so about 6, 7 years that I've been really focusing in on it. And I only published this year.
Okay, well, so if you don't mind me asking, I would love to ask why the delay. If you were writing in 8th grade, was there something particular that was preventing you from doing it right away? or
Uh,
what changed in 2017 that got you
right.
kickstarted?
Right. So, I mean, I just wrote some silly little detective mysteries in middle school for a project. I wrote one and then I really liked it, so I wrote a second one. And then we turned them into a very, very, very terrible YouTube short that we actually entered into a film contest, and it's dreadful and it's still out there somewhere, and hopefully no one ever finds it. I'm not even going to say the name because I don't want anyone to ever find it because we were middle and high schoolers. But then I just didn't. I came up with the idea for my book in high school,
Okay.
but I never had time to really sit down and do it because as soon as I graduated high school, I was in college and I was working full time in college, and I was paying my own bills and stuff, and so I was constantly doing stuff, and I was in clubs and stuff too. So there was never any time for writing.
Hmm.
But when I graduated, I managed to graduate debt free because I had some scholarships I'd earned, and I worked just so much in college that I got out without any debt. And my fiance at the time was she still had 2 years left.
Hmm.
So it's like, okay, I'm not in a position where I have to take up a job to pay off all my school debt immediately. Let's spend the next 2 years until she's out, and let's see if we can write a book in that time. Because I've had an idea for one that I've been thinking about for the last almost decade at that point. And so that's sort of what gave me the time and the energy to sort of dive into that. And life, of course, happened, and it took a little longer than the 2 years I had planned, but we got there in the end.
Well, I'm impressed that you even had a plan. As someone like myself who doesn't plan ahead of time, I just started writing without any plans. I was like, I'll figure it out as we go. So you actually had like a timeline that you were targeting for finishing the book, which
Hmm.
is pretty impressive. So let's talk about the book. I
Okay.
think it's fantasy. Is that correct?
It is fantasy. It's kind of it's a bit of a genre bender.
Okay.
I've had a hard time nailing it down because it just excuse me it overlaps with so many genres. And every time I give someone one genre, they're like, oh, so it's like this. And they take that and go a different direction with it. They get like a little piece of it. Right. So when I say it's got dystopian elements, everyone's like, oh, so it's sci-fi. No, it's not sci-fi. Or when I say it's a military epic, well, there's a military characters in it. And my co-author's in the military, and he influenced a lot of the writing and the characters because I really wanted those elements to be good and like for military people to read them and not cringe, you know. Then it's epic fantasy for sure because it's got fae and elves and dwarves and an adventure call to arms and stuff. So I've been kind of describing it as an apocalyptic modern epic fantasy.
That is impressive. In a nutshell, just all of those
Mhm.
things. I mean, that's really cool though. So, I mean, when you set out to write this story, did you already have in mind the genre you expected it to be, or were you just surprised as you kind of had all of these elements? Like, all right, well, now I have to classify what this book is post
Yeah,
writing.
it was tricky to classify it from the beginning. I knew it was going to be a fantasy, but I had the basic concept down from the get go because the concept came to me in high school in a dream. I was always into the Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, and then in high school, my dad showed me one of his favorite action movies from the '80s, which was, if you've seen it, Red Dawn, which is
Hmm.
about America being invaded by communists and taken over overnight, and Americans have to fight. It was like guerrilla tactics in like the '80s in more of a modern setting. So I had a dream that night that involved like Red Dawn with like orcs and stuff, and that's where I got the idea. I'm like, okay, what if our world, our modern world, was overrun by fantasy creatures? What kind of a story would that be? So that's where it's kind of hard to categorize because there aren't a lot of stories like that. You could say it's urban fantasy, you could say it's rural fantasy if you want, because it takes place in a small town in Georgia, but it's definitely an epic fantasy.
And it's quite lengthy. I love lengthy books, so I'm going to go ahead and say there's not a problem with that. I'm a big book reader kind of person. Uh,
Mhm.
so are you a plotter, first of all, if you don't mind me asking? Do you generally plot out your story before you write it?
Yes, I'm a little bit of both, but I'm probably more of a plotter because I had when we tackled it, I have 3 books planned, right? So I guess I
Mhm.
can't be anything but a plotter if I've got 3 planned out, right?
Well,
And they
I
have an
mean,
outline,
it depends on how specific, because I think there's a
yeah,
balance. There's always a balance. I don't think anybody is just
right,
one or the other. Obviously, well,
right.
I guess I have heard stories of authors who have outlined so specifically that when they actually wrote down, they only added sentences here and there.
Wow.
I was like, that is Impressive.
That's intense.
So I can't imagine. But I mean, generally, most people are kind of just a spectrum or kind of somewhere in between.
Mhm.
But you have a pretty good idea, at least for books 2 and 3, what's going to happen before
Oh
the
yeah.
ending. Sounds like
Yeah, there's a lot of plotting, and I know a lot of authors measure by word count. I don't measure by word count. I measure by where I am in the chapters I have planned out.
interesting.
So
That's
I've
definitely
got a
plotting.
long document. Yeah, yeah, I've got a long document with each chapter and a short description, and that's how I track my progress. Is okay, what chapter are we on out of the ones we have planned? And those, of course, fluctuate immensely. My
Interesting.
my first draft of the first book had 42 chapters and ended up with 57.
Hmm.
So there's a lot that goes into that and that planning, and I'm constantly planning and taking notes and adding things to it and expanding on it.
Oh, so you started writing the book then in 2017.
Mhm.
So it took roughly 6 years to get it to where it needed to be for publishing.
Right.
Okay.
Right. It took about 2.5 years to get the first draft done.
Hmm.
During that time, I actually launched a Patreon where I had followers who were paying to read by chapter, as I produced it, because it's like I'm putting a lot of time into this, and my situation's changed, and I needed some money, so I was able to finance it a little bit that way, and that actually helped partially pay for my wedding. Um, but the first draft I think got finished around 2019, and it's had about six drafts, 6 rounds of edits that we've gone through on the first one.
That makes me want to pull my hair out.
Oh yeah, I'm still fixing things.
Well, I feel
Indie publishing, there's still some things that need little grammar tweaks, or like a quotation mark that is next to the period instead of next to the next line where the quotation starts. That a buddy of mine sent me a picture of last night, and I wanted to jump off a cliff.
it does make it even more challenging, particularly when you're going with publishing through like Ingram Spark and you have
Hmm.
to pay every time you make changes. It's so fun. It's great. But we don't have to talk about those. We're talking about the positive parts of publishing, okay, Mick?
Right, right.
So that being said, where did the inspiration? You told me where the inspiration came for your story,
Mhm.
but what about for the characters? Because how many
Okay.
POVs are we looking at in your book? Do you have lots of
Yeah,
POVs, or is it just
yeah.
one?
There are three primary POVs.
Okay.
Peter Blair, who is he's the captain of a mercenary organization, like a modern mercenary organization, Black Ops contracting group. We have Sarah Young, who is she's a journalism student at the college that the book takes place in. And then we have Sean Castillo, who is a about 14-year-old teenage boy who ends up wrapped up in things because it's the apocalypse, and his parents are killed during the event known as the Shattering. And so those are my three primary POVs. I have a lot of extra POVs. There's a chapter from the perspective of a basilisk, which is kind
Hmm.
of fun. I got kind of bonus POVs here and there. There's one or two chapters from side characters, some villain chapters, stuff like that, to just kind of flesh things out and just kind of tackle things fun. Probably one of the hardest ones to write was from the perspective of a dryad, because it's third person omniscient. So I wrote a chapter from the perspective of a dryad who mind melts with a dwarf, kind of.
Hmm.
And so that's a really interesting POV to get into.
I can only imagine. Yes. So that's really fascinating though. So this is very interesting to me. I love multi POV stories. My books, most of them have multiple perspectives, although
Mm,
the POV has the same, not the same voice, the same it's like it's all third person. I don't really have a third
right.
person omniscient or switching between third and first. I think it's always interesting when people try that. Never tried it before. But did you find it difficult to maintain the voice throughout the entire book for each of these different POVs? Because it seems like they're for very
Yeah.
different demographics.
Oh
Which
yeah,
is
yeah.
fun.
They're all very different, and they're all inspired by different people I've met or experiences I've had. And the characters have taken on lives of their own. So any character that was inspired by anyone has taken on their own. They're not that person by
Right.
any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, that's something that I sort of I've learned that I have to kind of tackle in the second draft.
Hmm.
First draft, I have to get the main story points and the plot points and make sure everything moves and makes sense. And then second draft is where I go through and I hone in on the voices. And that's for sure tricky. That's one of the things I've been the most nervous about, because I want each person to have a distinctive voice. But the feedback I've gotten, I've absolutely succeeded on that, which is very encouraging to hear. Because yeah, the three main POVs are all vastly different and they overlap a lot. Sean travels a lot with Peter, so you have to have those distinct voices between them. And then there's of course a lot of side characters who all have to have distinct voices, which is it's tricky. But once you kind of figure it out, it comes almost naturally after a certain point.
No, I definitely agree with you because the Library Chronicles that I've written, the trilogy,
Mhm.
is written from three main POVs. So two protagonists and one antagonist, actually, one of the villains. I do constant POVs of him, which is super fun. And
Mhm.
then I'm throwing in the side characters. But I'm curious, I'm going to ask you this in just a second. A particular challenge for me was the POVs were all different age groups as well, different
Right.
generations. So I had a
Right.
teenager and then a woman in her 20s or in mid 20s, and then a man in his mid 30s.
Mhm.
And those were the three different POVs. So it was very interesting to try to, it's kind of that genre bending, maybe not as complicated as yours, but I don't feel like I couldn't assign an age group necessarily. So mine
Sure.
was like, it's not really, it's written for adults. It's definitely written for adults.
Right. Right.
But it's got this teenage POV in there as well as kind of this new adult POV and adult. So it's kind of
Yeah.
fascinating. It's really fun to
Yeah.
write that. But so are yours all kind of general similar age? I mean, you mentioned the 14-year-old boy. I would imagine Sarah and
Mhm.
Paul are not teenagers. Definitely not Paul.
Sarah's like in college around 20, and then Peter's late 20s.
Okay.
So yeah, they're different. They're different ages. And yeah, so Sean. So the things that helped me was having other people's influence, right? So this is a collaborative work. I have a co-author. He started out as an editor, and he's been so involved that I insist that he call himself a co-author, even if he insists otherwise. But like we've met every weekend almost for the last 7 years. So and he even wrote a chapter or two in book two. So he's a co-author at this point, whether he likes it or not. So having him, he's a captain in the military currently. He's been serving there for a couple of years, and he was able to help me hone in on Peter's his voice and his perspective and make sure he sounds and talks and reads like he's a military guy. And then my wife is a young lady who went to college and she studied English, so she's able to help me kind of hone in on Sarah Young's kind of voice. But she's also, because she teaches middle school and high school, she knows how teenagers are. And I've got four younger brothers, so I've been around a lot of teenage boys. So that's helped me, and her experience around those teenagers constantly helps me really hone in on having a teenage character voice, because as we get older, we get farther away from that and
Mm-hmm.
that line of thinking, and really honing in and making sure he's a realistic teenager without being an unbearable realistic teenager is a tricky balance to hit.
Yes, I believe I said the name Paul. You said his name was Peter, so
Mhm. No
amend
worries.
that. Sorry about that. I don't even know why I try and say names. I can't even remember people's names for the most part, but I know faces. Faces are good for
Mhm.
me. So I mean, I was about to ask if these people know that the characters were inspired by them. So the answer is
Mhm.
yes, because they're very heavily
Yeah,
involved with the
yeah,
process, which is excellent.
yeah. I mean, Sarah Young, that is based off two friends of mine from when I was a lot younger, who I've pretty much fallen out. Well, not fallen out, but I've just lost contact with them.
Hmm.
And then slightly off of a cousin of mine because she's a quarter Korean, which is I take for a cousin of mine who's a quarter Korean because I thought that would be an interesting perspective to add to it. But other than that, Sean is named after a friend of mine named Shawnee, directly based off him. Peter Blair originally started out kind of following my own, because there's no better perspective than your own perspective.
Hmm.
But he's gone very far from that.
He's developed, become
He has
something.
developed immensely. He's taken on his whole new, unique personality and stuff and perspectives. So,
So that being said, this is not a fair question to ask
oh
of
no,
authors because you don't always have an answer. But who is your favorite character to
mm,
write?
to
That's hard
write,
because there's so many. I can say lots of things about my own books, but
sure.
curious to know about you. Which one did you enjoy writing the most?
That is tricky because I enjoy writing them, all of them. So I
Mm,
really, really liked writing Shadowfang, the basilisk,
okay.
because it was just such a unique perspective to add to the story. It's a monster that is just out there to eat people. So that was really fun. Um, Peter comes the most naturally to me, and his story progression is a very interesting one. He is trying to do the right thing in a world where it's hard to do the right thing.
Mm, mm-hmm.
His story, his journey is it's kind of tackling the question: how much can you do to survive in an evil world and remain good? And at what point do you cross over and join the other side, sort of? Because his whole thing is he's very focused on saving anyone and everyone he can. Um, but he's faced with a choice very early on where he has a cursed sword that speaks to him when he sleeps. He meets a creature in his dreams, and he speaks to that creature, and that creature says, well, if you kill, you will gain power, and I'll help you become more powerful, but you got to kill things. So that's kind of his kind of journey, and so I really enjoy getting into the psychology of his perspective. And he's got some deeper traumas from his time in the military, and just watching and developing that and striking a balance with that is tricky, but it's really fun to kind of see his character progress and change throughout the story. But I also love writing Sean's perspective because it's a very different one, and I have kind of an end place I want his personality and goal to be. And and he's growing more as the story goes on, because time passes differently for a teenager than it does for an adult. So that it is a very unfair question to ask. You were right.
I told you it was unfair, but I was going to do it anyway
You gave
because
me fair warning.
I did. I give you fair warning. I agree with the writing teenagers thing. For some reason, it comes to mind of so many books where teenager acts a certain way, whether or not it's realistic. Then all of a sudden,
Right.
teenager picks up a sword and they're acting like an adult suddenly. Just like I feel like we've
Yeah.
entered the realm of Power Rangers. They push a button and
Right.
suddenly they're fighting like masters and
Right.
they're talking like adults. It just cracks me up. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't like that type of character development. I prefer realistic character development,
Yes,
but
that's why I came up with Peter. Right, is because as much as I enjoy the farm boy trope, the farm boy picks up the sword and he goes out there and does what he's got to do. In reality, the farm boy dies 5 minutes in
yeah,
90% of the time, right?
it's
So
true.
that's why I created Peter and gave him this military background and stuff, is because even if the world is not like anything he's ever seen, I wanted someone who could believably survive and lead in it because
Hmm.
he has this experience, right? And then Sean's entire character is based on the concept and the anytime you in take in media, there's a lot of times in a lot of stories, there's always a child that sees something or hears something or notices something, and everyone ignores them until it's too late.
Hmm.
I created Sean to be the antithesis to that. He is the child, and he sees and notices things, and you should listen to him. And people actually do for once, because I wanted to kind of turn that on its head, because it always drove me insane. The reason he ends up going with Peter on some of his adventures is because there's an old dwarf lady who's like, "Hey, the kid notices things other people don't. Take him with you."
Mm-hmm.
And so he's constantly struggling because he's not a born fighter by any means. He has no super special chosen one thing about him. He's just along for the ride with professionals, a group of black ops dudes who are training him in small things along the way and keeping him alive. And of course, he picks things up along the way.
So fascinating. I think that's a really smart way to do it, though. I think, obviously there's lots of different ways to do it. And this is in no way knocking teenagers that pick up swords and get super
Sure.
powerful and crazy, right? It's fine. I do like to see that character development. So it's cool that you've leveraged the expertise and knowledge of another character to ensure that teenager doesn't get their head cut off in the first 5 pages, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's whether or not that was I mean, it was plotted in your case, but whether or not you're a discovery writer, that is one method to make
Sure.
things feel more realistic and also entertaining. I also like the perspectives for me. It keeps the book really fresh as you're bouncing back and forth between different point
Yeah.
of views, as long as it's done well.
Right.
So I have read some books where the POVs are intended to be different, but they're the same. And so it
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't have the same type of effect. But yours are not only different ages, but have vastly
Mm-hmm.
different situations, which makes
Right.
it relatively easy, I think, to keep the POVs different.
Yeah, and I mean they're not all always in the same group either. So you get
Hmm.
different areas and different stories to kind of look at. Sarah does not go with them on their journey. Sarah's got her own journey going on. She discovers almost immediately she's got magic, so she goes under the Gandalf as character's wing and starts learning that to try and keep the main city protected. And so it has someone there who knows what they're doing. Whereas Peter is going out and trying to find out what's going on, explore the world, see what's out there, see what needs to be done. You know, and Sean may or may not stick with him the whole time. He's mostly under the wing of a Peter's companion, who is O'Cleary, who's a Irish sniper,
Mm.
um, Black Ops guy who's got kind of a tired dad energy about him. He more takes him under his wing than Peter does, but they're
He's
buddies. So yeah, yeah, definitely having distinct things that you can. The really fun thing is Peter's journey you have his justification for everything he does, right? He
Hmm.
justifies it to himself. But then when Sean's traveling with him, you get another perspective on his changes and the decisions he makes from a
Yep.
younger, more innocent who may worship him like idol, he's a teenage boy. This guy's a kicks butt, real strong fighter. Of course, he's going to look up to him, but he sees the changes and he sees the mistakes and he's able to add a perspective to this character that he doesn't have for himself.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think that, like I said, sounds fascinating. Sounds like the type of book I'd really enjoy reading. And then we haven't even delved into the world building aspects of it because it
Right.
sounds to me like, I mean, you mentioned that it's almost urban fantasy, but
Mm-hmm.
not at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
They have modern sounding names, but you're talking about
Right.
orcs and fae and, dwarves and things like that. So is this almost like story where worlds meld together? For some, this is going to sound so cheesy. For some reason, this is making me think of this is probably a little bit more along the lines of Portal fantasy. But have you ever heard of the
Mm-hmm.
TV series 10th Kingdom by any
Have
chance?
not.
It was
I think the
super
anime
old.
term would be isekai, I assume would
Oh,
be the
that sounds
same thing as
familiar.
Portal Fantasy, where characters from one world go to another.
Correct. So it's not quite the same.
Yeah,
Yours sounds
that's
like they
isekai.
meld together,
Yeah,
kind
so
of
the
in a way.
concept, the core concept, which we haven't even talked about as we've been talking about. So thousands and thousands of years ago, there were multiple races that lived in harmony on our planet. You had elves, dwarves, orcs, and humans who were part of what were known as the Feligir. And then you had the Femia, which would be things like centaurs or satyrs or dryads or goblins, right?
Hmm.
Lesser races who are created out of magic instead of created by the creator. And I've got a lot of lore around that. But the essential lore is thousands and thousands of years ago, humanity made a mistake that resulted in a cataclysmic flood that was going to destroy the entire planet. So the elves and the dwarves got together and said, "Hey, we're going to pull ourselves out and just let humanity die off." And something went wrong with the spell, and it didn't wear off when the flood ended. And
Mm.
thousands of years passed, and we got to modern times, and then the spell breaks, and the sky literally shatters, and humanity is almost wiped out of existence as these creatures pop back into our reality.
Sounds super intense. I'm assuming that happens near the beginning of the book.
That happens in the prologue, and then we skip
Okay.
about a month into after this, and we pick up with the characters who are in an isolated small Georgia town, and there's technology's dead, so they don't know what's going on.
Mm.
And they start to figure out things are going on when a basilisk rolls into town and starts eating people. And then a little dwarf lady, who one of the main characters has known his whole life, who has somehow never been on the other side of the spell, says, "Hey, here's kind of what's happening. And by
Hmm.
the way, I'm not human."
By the way, minor details, right?
Minor details.
I mean, it sounds like almost dystopian horror elements. I'm not quite
Right.
horror, but I mean,
Right. There are
basilisk.
some horror elements. There are. I will not hide that.
I mean,
It's
it's
not by any extension full horror, but there are some scary bits to
yeah, absolutely. The cover doesn't look very horror-esque, so I wouldn't assume that looks very fantasy. But
it. Hmm.
the concept sounds absolutely fascinating. So how much time did you spend crafting the lore and the world outside of the writing phase? And how much of it did you do while you were writing?
Constantly.
Okay, so it was kind of a build upon it during the writing process as
Hmm.
well, because
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of authors that like, oh, I create a whole language before I even started writing, or
Right.
I set up
Right.
maps and kingdoms and politics and relationships before I even wrote the first word of this story. I wasn't sure if
Right.
you spent a lot of time crafting that before you got to the actual writing of the story.
Some of it,
Okay.
right? Like the origin, the origin thing
Mm.
with why the Fae were out of our world and why they came back. I had the general sense there, but it's developed along the process. I've been writing like the origin of the species in my spare time, which I didn't start until after. But it's still I've had concepts for a long time that have fed into everything because I made sure before I went into these groups to make sure I had general ideas of what their culture and what the foundation of their culture and stuff was, because I wanted to have these things, these fantasy creatures that everyone's familiar with, but I really wanted to put a twist on them and make them fresh. You
Yeah.
know, so I've heavily focused in on that, and there's some fun things with that, like the elves are you would expect elves like the tall pointy ears,
Mm.
immortal beings, right? So I was like, okay, so what would it look like if you were immortal, except unless you were killed? Immortal, but not invulnerable. So a big thing with their culture is they're incredibly warlike and war focused, because if the only way for them to die is for them to be killed, they're going to make sure they're about as unkillable as possible.
Yeah, I mean,
You know?
naturally, yes, I would
Yeah.
imagine. Very skilled at defense and fighting and maybe military maneuvers,
Hmm.
perhaps the best way to say that. But so, curious, just timeline wise, because we've got Peter
Hmm.
who's been in the military, and
Hmm.
then this instance happens. Um, so I guess is all of his military colleagues, are they also slain in this, and he's just kind of left alone, or does he have any people that he's working with as
Yeah.
well?
Great question. So Peter is not no longer in the American
Oh,
military. He's
that's
part of a
right.
private contracting group
Okay.
called S&W, which
Okay.
stands for the Silent Night Warriors, which was founded by his grandfather. And so that the training base actually for that organization is in the city of Paragon, where the story takes place.
Hmm.
So he's actually lucky enough to, when it happens, they're all isolated, and he's got a bunch of his fellow mercenaries around him. And that's one of the reasons Paragon's able to be in a place where it's not as devastated as everything else. Is you've got this military group who's familiar with intense situations, and they're able to help keep this town sustained and create order and peace and quell riots and stuff in a way that other people wouldn't be able to do. And so there's also a political element to that, because you've got this incredibly skilled black ops group that sort of independently operates outside of any government that exists here, because
Hmm.
what government can exist in an apocalypse, and that's kind of a question we tackle. So there's a surrounding cast with him. The primary ones being his buddy O'Cleary, who's a sniper. We've got Jenny, who's an information officer who has a dog named Hotch, which is wearing like a whole military vest and stuff, and is the one character that is completely safe for the entire series. My wife has made it very clear I'm not allowed to hurt the dog. So most people aren't safe, but the dog is. No worries, everyone.
They're so fascinating. I mean, there's this idea you can be killing or injuring really beloved characters in books, and
Yeah,
people, they react accordingly. If you injure an animal or something happens, it's amazing. The riots, the
right,
people will come with pitchforks to your house and burn it
right.
down as wild. I just think it's an interesting phenomenon. I've not been
I agree.
a pet person most of my life, but it's funny to hear your wife very adamant about the dog's protection. Love it. I think that's
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Uh, so with the we're kind of switching gears again. I love the ideas
Okay.
that you've put together for these. Um, and I love all of the influence that the feedback that you've received from people who are in these spaces or who have been in these spaces. Were these people that were constantly reading each chapter as you put them out, like your Patreon group? Did they come along the
Mhm.
journey with? I know your co-author did, but did your wife
Sure.
also come along the whole journey with you?
Yeah, my wife was an English major, so
Oh,
she
nice.
she brings that to the field. She's done a lot of the editing for it. I'm constantly bouncing ideas off her nonstop all the time. It, I feel bad for her because it's so constant. But she's very invested in the story. She's had a lot of influence on the story. She's responsible for several characters' deaths, to put it mildly. I also want to make sure I avoided any potential accusation that could ever come of. I'm sure you've heard of men writing women,
Mm-hmm.
as a thing and making fun of that. I wanted to make sure there was no chance. So every bit of female dialogue is run by her and improved by her, and she's commented on it. And she's also the main person who keeps me in check with like my magic system, because I have a magic system and it's very thought out. And we designed it together. And anytime I'm like, well, what if they do this with magic? She's like, well, does that work? Or I don't think that works, and plays devil advocate with it and make sure it's consistent. We don't write any plot holes in on ourselves and stuff. As far as the Patreon goes, there was a good buddy of mine, Blake, was pretty. He was along for the ride. He's like my number one alpha reader. He reads stuff even before alpha readers get anything.
Wow.
Like currently he reads every first draft of stuff after Dave and I look at it, and just makes notes on it and minor stuff like that. It didn't really have any major influence or effect on the overall story, but it was another perspective where I'm like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Kind of pick his brain a little bit as well, and still doing that to this day.
But I mean, I think it's great that you pre-established that, because I know there's a lot of authors out there who are writing in isolation,
Right.
which is challenging, because at some point you do need to have that external feedback, whether it's at the beta
Right.
phase, the ARC reader phase, the alpha phase, whatever it is, that feedback does have to come. So it's amazing that you have this support network of people who are supporting you and just loving this story throughout the whole journey. I think that's really cool that you've
Yeah,
identified these relationships.
it's a collaborative work, and it's so much better for that. If
Hmm.
it had just been out of my mind and I written it in isolation, it would not be near the story it is. It would not have the twists and turns it has. The characters would not be as fleshed out as they are. It is absolutely a collaborative work, and I think that has improved its quality drastically as other people have been involved in this. And like I've written probably 90% of the words in it, but
Hmm.
those were all influenced and adjusted by and commented on and uh, compiled together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's 700 and something pages.
Sure.
720 is pages. So what's the plan for the next books? Are those going to be, are we looking at like the third book's going to be 2000 words or 2000 pages? I mean, by the time you get to it.
Honestly, I would love it if it was. I love long books. For a long time on Audible, I wouldn't buy an Audible book unless it was at least 40 hours if it was a fantasy.
Wow.
Because I was like, I'm not getting my money's worth unless I'm listening to this for a full work week. I love long books. The problem with long books is they're expensive to produce.
Hmm.
The book is pricey, and that's unavoidable. I'm not going to be out of the hole I've dug for myself with this until I've sold a couple thousand copies. So I'm a long way off. I'm confident we'll get there eventually, as is my wife, which is why we went with private published or indie publishing and published it ourselves, because we didn't want to compromise the story in any capacity. We wanted to make sure it was still the story we had, and I cared more about getting it out to people than I did about making a profit initially.
Yeah.
But currently I'm working hard on book two. Book two has, I'd say we're about 80 something percent of the way through the first draft. I'm working on late 30s out of 44 planned chapters. It's looking like it's going to come out, the first draft, about 130,000 words.
Hmm.
Um, the final draft of, no, 150,000. The final draft of Paragon exhorting him was 230,000. So we're about 80,000 short of that right now, but it's only the first draft. So traditionally, the second book is longer than the first book when it comes to fantasy. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case, because
No.
the way I've had to do the world building, I don't know that that's going to be how it plays out.
Yeah, it
We'll
doesn't
see.
have to be. I mean, I've seen it done many
Right?
ways
Absolutely not.
before. Uh,
Absolutely not.
my books generally progress that way. So the first book that I published was about 145K words. The second one was 155, and then the third one was 192, I believe.
Yeah. I would
So they
love if
did
it
progress
is.
that way.
I would love if it is, because I like more and more story. But I don't know, to
I
be
mean,
perfectly honest. We'll see. And like people wanted me to split this one up, right? And we debated that pretty heavily, about splitting it in half and turning it into two books. So the conclusion we came to was, if we split it in half, we're just going to expand on the things that are in it, and we're going to end up with two books that are probably
hmm
close to the same length anyway, because that's how we would want to tackle it to make sure it felt right. But
hmm
it's long, but it's easy to read.
That's good. That's really good. It has a good flow pacing. I think that's really important,
Yeah, yeah.
particularly for long books.
It drags you, not drags you. It puts
Pulls you
weight,
along,
pulls you along from one
sweeps you and
chapter to the
sucks
next,
you in.
sweeps you
Yeah,
in. There you
we
go.
don't
There
do
you go.
dragging, particularly for really interesting books. Yeah, I was taking a look at your book cover. Did you commission a book cover artist specifically for that? Did you do this art yourself? How did you go about getting? No, not an artist.
Yeah, no, no. I have what's essential tremors, so I'm constantly
Oh,
shaking. So I make a
okay.
lot of typos, which makes things super helpful. But I cannot draw anything at all. I drew a cute deer once, and I think I held on to it for years because it's the only good thing I've ever drawn. No, we looked at a lot of different authors, or not authors, artists. I've gotten a lot of like concept art off of Fiverr and stuff.
Mhm.
So I went searching through Fiverr and Twitter and stuff. So the artist I ended up hiring has actually worked on Magic the Gathering cards. She won a Tolkien Society award a few years ago. She's apparently done some book covers. We just compared a couple people, and we felt like she would be able to capture the essence of what we were looking for, the best. And it was a little pricey, but it was well worth it. I think the cover is gorgeous. I'm very happy with it. I hope we make it big enough to be able to afford her for the second one.
That is the hope,
uh,
isn't it? Yes, I totally
yeah,
understand that. The cost of everything, particularly for large books, I can relate because I also write not as big as that, but big-ish books. It
sure.
just adds up quite a bit. So yeah,
Yes, it does.
there's the dream. But having a good cover, the cover is gorgeous. As a colorblind person, I can't quite tell you what colors they are, but it looks good to me. So it looks enticing and interesting. And so let's see. Paragon Exordium is that how
Hmm.
you pronounce the title?
Yep, that's it. You got it. Paragon Exordium.
Do you already know the titles? You don't have to reveal them if you don't want to, but do you
I
already
do.
know the titles of the second and third?
Hmm. Uh,
Nice.
Paragon Attrition is going to be the second one, and
Nice.
then the third is planned to be Paragon Retribution.
Okay. Now, how do you plan on because books that are this large, I know there's a lot of indie authors that like to write offshoot short stories of the side
Sure.
characters, and they kind of like to expand this as much as they can. They sometimes even like to write a prequel story, which is super
Hmm.
fun. Do you have plans in the works to add additional like side stories, short stories, prequel off of
Right.
this story?
So this is like we've talked about. This has been a collaborative work. I want this to continue to be a collaborative universe. My co-author is writing a horror novella
Hmm.
based off some characters who disappear after the first act and what happens to them. One of my beta readers is writing a spin-off that he wants to create about a dwarven city in Canada that is made of glass. I would love to work with other authors to create stories in this world because it takes place across the globe. So there's so much room and opportunity for continued stories within
Mm-hmm.
this. In my spare time, whenever I have a chance or I need to get the writing juices flowing and they're not flowing for this, I work on my own kind of Silmarillion I'm trying to create, just lore and background kind of legends and stuff. We have two follow-up series that we have ideas for that we've come up for and already started laying the seeds for in the first books, for later on. One that would be like 20 years after the first series, and one that would be like 100 years later, to see how the world has changed. We're working on a like a D&D kind of adventure
Hmm.
that we would record for a podcast that would take place in this world, and have some voices and kind of do a podcast episodic thing that would probably be a little less canon, but would enable people to play games within the world. I am always down if other authors reading are like, hey, I would like to tell a story in this world. Here are the rules. Review with me. I'll work with you on it, and let's create something new, like Star Wars. Star Wars has dozens and hundreds of authors at this point, probably, that are expanding on that universe.
Hmm.
I am here to create a franchise. This is going to be massive if we get the success and get it out there. I want to involve people. If you read it and you're like, hey, this is great, I'd love to tell a story in this world at some point, let me know. Let's talk it out. Let's do it. Because the other thing is we've got a world in a setting where you can have whatever genre you want. You can write a romance, you can write a horror, you can write just a fun adventure novel. It can be whatever you want in this world, and it's just a backdrop for more and more story.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's amazing. It just brings to mind Brandon Say. I'm sure you're familiar with Brandon Sanderson, how he just
Mm-hmm.
brought on another author to help write more books
Right.
in the world, and it makes me think about that. It's really really fascinating. I probably won't, only because I have plenty of other stories that I need to get
I'm
out of
sure.
my head. That there's a queue, and it just keeps
Sure. Yeah.
building up because I there's all sorts of things. But I do love the idea of almost like multiverse type thing. I know it's not quite the same thing,
Right.
but in the fantasy equivalent of
Right.
that, which is really cool. I love getting into those and just getting sucked in and loving all these adjacent stories. It sounds so fun. It sounds a lot of fun. So that being said, when can we expect book two to be ready to go? The face. Oh no.
uh, like I said,
Undefined
we're
timeline.
undefined timeline. I'm hoping to have it ready for alpha readers, which I didn't do with book one really. But well, I guess I kind of do with the Patreon. I'm
Mhm.
hoping to have it ready for alpha readers by the end of the year if things
Okay.
go to schedule. We put this one out in May. I had a child in June. At the very beginning of June, we put this out. Like there were like 3 weeks between this releasing and the kid. And so my timeline for writing book two was slowed down, of course, because a child. and that, sleeping, it becomes harder, and it's an all-consuming full-time thing.
Hmm.
And I currently work from home, and she stays home with me. So those are factors, and so my pacing has slowed down, but we're still working hard at it, while also trying to promote book one now that it's out. So hopefully alpha readers by the end of the year, and then we'll see what it looks like as we go into round two. I'm a lot faster now than I was before.
Hmm.
I'll say that. I've got a lot more planned out. There's a lot less thinking that has to go into things as we create and build. We've got a foundation. So it'll be out faster than the first one, I hope, for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely is the case. You kind of pick up on the writing. You learn to write a little bit faster and edit faster, and it's so
Mhm.
that's good, especially after this big of a beast.
You're
Um,
right. Some people would say I've written several books at this point
I mean,
already.
in theory, yes, you have. You've written what, 4, 5 shorter books. So,
Right.
but yeah, this is great. I appreciate you joining me today. We are running short on time, but before
Okay.
we end here, where can people find more information about you and your book?
Yeah, you can find me on TikTok as Michael Melwasul. I'm on Instagram. I am on Facebook. I think those are the main. I'm on Twitter as well, or X, or whatever you want to call it. The book is on Amazon. There's an Etsy shop under my name, Michael Melwasul, as well, where I got a few signed copies available. I have my first book signing coming up in Georgia, in Statesboro, Georgia. If anyone's near that,
Nice.
it's about an hour from Savannah. October 21st. There's details for that on my Facebook page, but I'm very available and happy and eager to talk to people. There's a few things I enjoy more than talking to people as they read my book. So if anyone picks it up and wants to respond to things, or pick my brain, just hit me up. I will probably reply very quickly. And just look, I want to throw out one other thing, before we wrap up. It is a clean fantasy. It is written for adults, but it can be consumed by any age. I've had readers of every age, and I've had 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds pick it up and devour it. I've had 67-year-olds. A coworker of mine is 67. She finished it and said, "I am, as soon as I get the opportunity, I'm giving it to my grandson who's 16 to read, so we can talk about it." We were very intentional about it being a clean fantasy. It is written, like I said, for adults. The subject matter is aimed for adults, but it can be read by anyone at any age, because we want it to be an all-encompassing, and, like, Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings. You can read that at any age, and you enjoy it and appreciate it for different reasons at every age.
Hmm.
So not everyone might want to sit down and read it to their kids, depending on what your feelings are, but you could if you
Hmm.
wanted to, and you're
I
not going to
love.
run into any cursing or any spice in there. The characters curse, but it's not explicit, because I wanted my siblings and my family to be able to read it as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So it's a clean adventure epic.
I'm glad you brought that up because that is that type of book I like to read, this type of book I like to write as well. So
Mhm.
definitely pick it up if you haven't already. Well, thanks for your time. This has been great.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, I hope you found that interview helpful and insightful, particularly if you are interested in reading or writing that genre. I personally heard about his book and thought, why don't I have your book yet in my hands? Because it sounds exactly like the type of book that I would love reading. So that's pending. This is one of those things where I would love to be able to purchase and read, particularly read the books of the people I have on my podcast before the interviews. Fortunately, when writing and reading time combat, the writing time does trumpet often. So I'm reading little bits here and there often while I'm just brushing my teeth. But I will get to it. I love books on my bookshelf. So they look great. And why not have a collection, particularly of books that I know my kids might enjoy as well. So next week, episode 93, we will be talking to C.J. Isley about how expertise in anything, in her case, it's expertise with medieval history as well as horse care, can really enhance your ability to write authentically and write in a convincing manner. So it's a really awesome conversation. We talk a lot about her interest in medieval things, how it has lent to her stories, how she's gone about writing her stories. It's a really great conversation, particularly because she and I have a lot of writing methods in common. So it was really fun to hear the way she goes about doing things and how she infuses her writing with her expertise. So, and pretty much anything, I've heard of a lot of authors who have expertise in very random things, microbiology or even human anatomy, or, all these various things, stamp collections, all these interesting interests that they've taken and put it in their books as a character interest, or maybe they have a character who's a marine biologist. I have an interest in linguistics, so I have thought about writing thrillers or mysteries with linguistics in mind because I love linguistics. Haven't done it yet. I'm a little too chicken to do that. But one of the things, take your expertise and enhance your writing with it. So you want to stick around for that conversation next week. Looking forward to that. As usual, if you are an author or a publisher or an artist or an editor or whatever you are, if you're related to publishing or business, would love to have you on the podcast. You can head to thecasualauthor.com. So once again, that is a new URL that I've secured, thecasualauthor.com. That'll take you to the podcast site as well. I'm working on overhauling that, or planning the overhaul of the site to make it more useful. Currently, it's pretty bare bones. I don't love it. I would love to have more clear-cut show notes. Maybe someday I'd love to have transcriptions, but at least now you can trust thecasualauthor.com, which, true to its name, actually matches the podcast. So thanks again for listening. If you have any comments, definitely comment or email me. I'd love to have a conversation with you. I always love to get to know the people who I'm talking to and hear what you want more of. So I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you next week.